Hi there, and a very warm welcome to this week's quick tip. This week we're going to talk about Cryptomatte. Now, the concept is very simple, but the execution in Octane can be a bit daunting, so hence I'm doing this tutorial. For people who are not familiar with Cryptomatte, it's basically a system inside of renderers that generates mattes of objects or materials without the user spending a lot of time setting it up. So basically, in the background, all objects or materials are classified, and for each and every object or material there are different mattes generated that can be accessed in compositing. For example, to isolate objects and then color correct them individually. I know I'm always saying this is going to be a fast one. I hope this time that holds true and we are going to get this done under 10 minutes. Let's see how we are doing. So in Cinema 4D, since Christmas is growing closer, I opted for a Christmassy scene that I can show the Cryptomatte workflow with. So let's get Cryptomatte started by going into the render settings here, and therefore make sure that Octane Render is set as a render engine. Go to the Octane render settings and there to render AOV group. If you're not familiar with that, the render AOVs replace the render layers of Octane in about Octane 2020, I think. Before we enable Cryptomatte, let me talk to you about the way we're going to save that. So Cryptomatte is a very special file that has a lot of information about the scene in it, and it needs to be saved through the EXR Octane format inside of the Octane render settings. Otherwise, if you save it through Cinema 4D, Cinema 4D only saves pictures and not EXR with a lot more information, and therefore it would be cut off, and that would make the workflow invalid. So make sure you have selected the render AOV, enabled it, and then choose the EXR Octane here. And of course, set a render path wherever you want in your file system. Those down here are more personal preferences, so I never save multi-layer files since I want my passes to be saved as single files, and I want to save the beauty with it since I don't want to save it through different outputs. I just want to rely on one output that is giving me all my passes that I set up. Speaking of setting up passes, let's do this. Let's go to the Render AOV Manager and set up the Cryptomatte. And for us, luckily enough, the Cryptomatte is the first pass here. Right now we just want to concentrate on Cryptomatte here, so let's double click it, and if we click on the Cryptomatte pass itself, it reveals its options. So you can see inside of the list here, there are different options to choose what the Cryptomatte is looking like, and we will go through all of them later. So why is this important? Later on in compositing, you want to choose objects or materials to create your mattes. So those mattes are created through different seeds or different processes. And the items in here are the different processes. So what I did in the following is I copied and pasted the Cryptomatte in here and choose every type of Cryptomatte. And those can live next to each other. So you're not restricted to use only one, you can use all of them next to each other. But there's advantages and disadvantages as always, and I'm trying to go through all of them next. But first of all, let's switch the render layer where I already have set up all the Cryptomattes here. If you tick on the VQHD resolution, you can see in the render layer AOV, I've set all of those layers that you can find here next to each other. Alright, so let's start rendering and see what we are getting. If you've set up everything correctly, you are greeted with something like this. Usually you're back in the main pass and you have to click on that first to be active. You might think that this looks awfully lot like a random color filter where you then are able to key out different colors to get your matte inside of your compositing app. But let me assure you that Cryptomatte is very different in the regard. So basically Octane gives you a false color image right now to visualize the different Cryptomattes. And in comp, you get a full black and white alpha channel that also supports blurs like motion blur or depth of field with it. And this false color image is just a way for Octane to let you know what different Cryptomattes you have in your scene. As you've seen before, as I set up the AOVs, you have quite a choice in what to set for a Cryptomatte, but there are some advantages and disadvantages again that I would go over with a chart that we are going to look at. Alright, it's chart time again, so I've made a list that goes from left to right, and the first thing is the Cryptomatte name. This is the list of AOVs you can choose from inside of Octane Cinema 4D. Then we have the stable column, and that means that some of them are unstable. So if you render your image multiple times, the ID of the Cryptomatte is changing every time you re-render, and therefore in your compositor you would reassign that ID every time you bring in your render again. This is not really nice and takes time, and so we don't want that. We want stable IDs that then when you re-render are already assigned because they have the same ID and therefore carry over to your comp program. And if you have assigned it once, it will stay that way and you can work with it really easily. Now, if you ask me why there are unstable IDs inside of Octane of Cinema 4D, I don't know, but the good thing is that we know about them and therefore we can not use them. The next column is defined by, and this means what is the ID defined by. So we have a changing ID per object or per material and other definitions here, and what is making the ID change. So in some objects here, for example, the material node name, it's literally the name of the material. And we have the same for geometry, so geometry node name is the name of the object in Cinema 4D in the object manager. Then we have IDs that are defined by the, for example, Octane tag name. If you have an object tag of Octane on your object, you can define different names and therefore create your IDs. And then we have IDs. We would be able to access them in the standalone, but we are not able to access them in Cinema 4D. So they are there, but they're basically useless in Cinema 4D. Last but not least, I have an overall thing of disadvantages here. So, of course, there's not only advantages for the EXRs with a Cryptomatte, but also disadvantages. For example, in Octane, they cannot have transparencies. So if you're looking through a window, you only see the Cryptomatte of the window class itself and nothing behind that. Also, and I think that's a more universal thing, Cryptomattes don't use reflections or refractions, and therefore they are just the definition of the object in your scene and cannot hold any additional information. Usually the Cryptomattes are rather small, but they can get very large if you have a lot of objects with different Cryptomattes each in your scene. So if you have a scene full of objects with thousands of objects, they can grow really large. This is just a thing you need to know. And as we already talked about, this can only be exported as Octane EXR. The other EXR methods inside of Octane and through Cinema 4D won't work. And since this is not a simple black and white image that can be loaded everywhere as a mask, you need to have special support in your comp software. So if your comp software is not supporting Cryptomattes, you can't use them. Last but not least, if you have need for transparencies or reflections, then there's other ways to do this in Octane. So in 2021, there was the Octane version that introduced the new custom AOVs, and they came with reflection and refraction support, so you can use those. I have a tutorial on the workflow of those if you're interested. Back into Cinema 4D, let's show you some of the things that go with the Cryptomattes. And first of all, there's a little trick if you don't have a chart handy, which shows you what different mats are stable and which are not. So if you hover over with your mouse over different mats, you can see that. So if we hover over an unstable one, that gives you a note, this cannot generate stable mat IDs. And therefore you know, for example, this mat is not stable. To show you what that means inside of the rendering, let's go to another unstable here. And you can see this is a mat that is unstable. If we hover over here, you can see that in the note back there. And basically, as I have spoiled before, if I would to re-render that, all the colors will be different then. So let's do this. It needs a while to update. So now that it has updated, you can see all the colors have changed, and that means in the background all the IDs for the crypto also have changed. And this means if you put that render out inside of the compositor, then you would need to select all your mats from scratch because the old ones are applied to IDs that no longer exist. And this is the reason why we want to get rid of all the unstable crypto passes in our renders. So as you've noticed, that reload took a very long time, and therefore I have prepared another scene that is much more simple and gives us all the information we need. So let's load it in here, and you can see we have just different objects with different materials and a cloner here with some clones, because there are special cases where you would need that as a Cryptomatte. Next, what I want to do is go over the attributes of every one of those stable Cryptomattes. So what I want to do is just tick off everything but one, and then go to those Cryptomattes and go into them and explain what to do to generate an ID in a quick succession. First of all, we have material node name, and as the name suggests, it is the naming of the materials that generates the ID. So for example, if I take my material O1, which is applied to the sphere, and name it material O2, we get the same ID, and we need to reload the scene to show it. Also, if we just take any other naming, for example O1, that means we will get a certain color here. And if we take it to O2, then we get a different color. And it is stable in the way that if the name is the same, we will get the same ID again. So we get this darker blue with O1. And if we go back to mat O1, we will have the same ID as before when we started. There are two Cryptomattes that are called pin name, namely the object pin name and the material pin name. They're pretty useless as they're showing the same Cryptomatte all over. The only way you can go around that is by getting an object with a selection, a poly selection, and then make a material and assign it to the selection, and this selection will then show up as a different ID. This only goes for the material pin name. The object pin name will always show the same ID for all its objects. And since the material selection can be also accessed in other cryptos, I almost never use the pin name cryptos. The object node name is getting its information from the Octane object tag. So let's do this and giving our objects an Octane objects tag. Here we go. So nothing has changed right now. Even if I reload, the material might change here, but there's the same node here. So what's happening is that the tag name controlling the mat or the ID that's assigned. So we can go ahead and call this sphere, for example. And you can see now that I've done that, it's creating a new ID. Also, again, like in the materials, those are stable. So if I call the sphere a cone, it will get the same ID as the cone. The geometry node name has the same characteristics as the material node name in that the name is defining the Cryptomatte. So let's show you by calling the sphere sphere instead of 1. And you can see that it changes its ID. Also, it's stable. As we set the sphere back to 1, it will get back its 1 attributes in terms of the color and ID. Last but not least, there's the user instance ID, and as the name suggests, it has something to do with render instances. So with the cloner here producing render instances, and this is giving us the colorful impression here, giving each of those render instances their own ID. But that's not all. We can also use that on objects via the Octane object tag. If we go into the object tag, there's a render instance ID, and we can fill in a number here and therefore create different IDs for different objects. As you can see, since the numbering is going up with our clones here, those coincide with the numbering of those objects here. So we have 1, which is the sphere, 2, which is the cylinder, 3, which is the cone, and 4, which is the cube. So back in our scene, I disabled all of the cryptomattes that we don't need, mainly the unstable ones, but also the ones with the pin name that were giving us a lack of information and therefore are not needed here as well. So what we are left with is the material node name, the object node name, the geometry node name, and the user instance ID. If you're not in need of a mat for every singular droplet on that class, I suggest to also turn off that mat. Let me go to the object node name real quick, and you can see that the color here is very uniform, and this is because we don't have defined any names in our object tags. So let's real quick demonstrate that by going to the class and set the object name from its default name to glass. Here we go. And if it's not showing up, it just needs a refresh. Here we go. And you can do that with all sorts of objects. Let's just trying to get another one here, and let's call that tablet. Here we go. Now we have another mat for our tablet. But since we don't want to do that, we want to have all the different objects as a different ID. The best way is the geometry node name, because all of the objects are named differently and therefore show up as different mats inside of the crypto. Note here that, for example, the candle and the front panel here is looking very similar, but since they are differently named, this is just a coincidence. And if you look closely, this is slightly more red than the candles, and this will also mean that it will turn up as a different crypto inside of your comp program. Since we are going with the geometry node name, let me turn off the other crypto passes here and then render this out as a final result. As our render has finished now and saved, let's carry on with the last step, which is compositing. I didn't save my renders as an ACES file, I did go with a linear workflow, but even if you did save ACES, your Cryptomatte workflow still should be working as intended. So let's get on here and bring in those both renders we did. Here we go. So we have the main image here, and then we have the Cryptomatte. So if we bring in the Cryptomatte, we can see nothing, and this is expected since all the information is hidden in the layering inside. To make this visible, we need to call for a plugin. Fortunately, that plugin ships with After Effects and is called Cryptomatte. So let's apply it to the render layer here. And now we can see we have some colors again. Those colors are different because every of those plugins represent those colors differently, but the ID behind those colors are the same that Cinema 4D saved out. With the plugin active now, we can go through the image here and select different portions of it, different objects, as a matte. And all the objects that were different meshes inside of Cinema 4D will become different mattes here. Now you can hold down Shift and get a matte for multiple objects. or hold down Alt to exclude objects from the mat. Let's say we want the ball and those two figures to be a little bit lighter on the original render. Here we go. So what you would do now is go and set the output instead of colors to the method RGBA. So you would get a matte, meaning an alpha channel. To use that, I want to go through an adjustment layer. So let's create one on the layer, new adjustment layer. Here we go. So to use that only on the portion where the alpha here is, there's a new way to do that. We need to pick whip that layer we need the alpha from, and this is our Cryptomatte. So as soon as we do that, the Cryptomatte vanishes and our adjustment layer is now active on that part that were the alpha before. Of course, we don't see anything because right now there is no effect on the adjustment layer. So let's do this. Let's add a curse, for example. And let's make the objects a little bit brighter. And you can see now the effect is only on those objects that are highlighted in our Cryptomatte here. Again, a small word of caution, since we are dealing with masks. They are never perfect, and if I turn them on again and zoom in here, you can see that there is a fringe happening, for example, on our yellow figure here. So I refrain from doing extreme stuff for that, for example, cutting out stuff or getting a really radical color correction on there. But for our small purpose of doing a little bit of a correction, this holds up remarkably well, and usually that's the case with all of the objects that come in with Cryptomattes. If you want to alter single objects really drastically, the best way to do that is to render them separately as a render layer, and I might go over that next week since we dealt with Cryptomattes this week, and this is a very close topic because it's also a multipass workflow. So hopefully I've gotten you interested in the workflow with Cryptomattes. It's very easy as you don't have to set up a lot, and it's taking the object name and giving every object of your scene its own mat. You can do this for materials too, of course. If you have different materials on one object, then they will show up accordingly. So this workflow is especially useful if you want to tweak your scene after the fact of rendering inside of your comp program, and tweak stuff like brightness or coloring, so you get the visual intent that you're after. I often do that with bigger scenes where it becomes harder to control every minute detail inside of rendering. And that again brings this topic to a close. I hope you learned something today. Thank you very much for sticking with me that long. I think next week's topic is clear, as that would be render layers. If you have any suggestions, please let me know in the comments. Also write in the comments what ideas you have for following tutorials. There's always the possibility that someone out there has a great idea that inspires me so much that I reschedule and take his idea instead of mine for the next tutorial. So maybe you are the one who does that. And that brings me to my final word. Thank you very much for watching, and happy cryptomatting!